The atmosphere in the house had shifted ever since Jake and Lisa ended their relationship. It was as though a shadow had settled over what was once a lively, cheerful space, casting a somber mood over everything. The breakup wasn't abrupt. I had noticed the cracks in their relationship forming over the months. Fewer visits, less laughter, and the subtle weight of sadness in Jake's eyes were signs I couldn't ignore. Still, even though I anticipated it, I don't think either of us was ready for the toll it would take on him. Jake had always been deeply emotional, even as a child. I used to joke that he wore his heart not just on his sleeve, but openly in his hands for the world to see. So, when he came home that night, his face pale and his eyes rimmed red, I didn't need him to say anything to know what had happened. He barely spoke, sinking into the couch as though he wanted to disappear, his body folding inward in an effort to make himself invisible. I sat beside him, feeling his pain as if it were my own. My chest ached for him, mirroring his sorrow. I wanted to reach out and hold him like I did when he was little, when a scraped knee felt like the end of the world. But I knew better now. When it came to his emotions, I had learned that it was best to let him come to me. "It's over," he finally murmured, his gaze fixed blankly on the television screen, though I could tell he wasn't paying attention. "I'm so sorry, Jake," I said softly. He gave a quick nod, a single tear slipping down his cheek before he wiped it away hastily. Watching him so broken was difficult. I wished I could take his pain away, but I also understood he needed to face it, to let it wash over him before he could begin to heal. In the days that followed, the house grew quiet. Jake moved through the rooms like a ghost, his presence muted and heavy. He spent most of his time in his bedroom, the door partially closed, a boundary I respected, even though it pained me. Despite him being home more often, the house felt emptier, as if the energy had been drained from it, leaving only the echoes of his quiet grief. About a week after the breakup, I found him sitting in the kitchen. He was at the counter, a half-eaten sandwich in front of him, staring off into space. Hoping he might open up even a little, I decided to join him. "Hey," I said gently, pouring myself a cup of tea before sitting down across from him. "Do you want to talk about it?" He lifted his gaze to meet mine, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the little boy who used to run to me with every scrape and bruise, trusting me to make things better. But he wasn't a child anymore, and this wasn't a pain that a simple bandage could fix. "There's not much to say," he replied flatly. "It just didn't work out. I'm sorry," I said again, knowing the words wouldn't fix anything but feeling compelled to say them. "You really loved her," I added quietly. He nodded, swallowing hard, and I could see him fighting to keep his composure. "Yeah," he admitted. "I thought we were going to get married. We talked about it." His confession hit me hard. I hadn't realized just how serious their relationship had been. "I know you did," I said softly, reaching out to place my hand over his. He didn't pull away, but he didn't reciprocate the gesture either. Instead, he just stared at our hands as though the sight was too much for him to bear. Over the next few weeks, Jake began spending more time with me, less with his friends or at work. It was almost as though he was seeking out my company, looking for a space where he could feel understood and safe. I didn't mind. In fact, I cherished it. It had been a long time since we had spent this much time together, and despite the circumstances, I found myself appreciating his presence. One sunny Saturday morning, I decided to take him for a walk in the park. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue, the kind of day that always lifted my spirits, and I hoped it might have the same effect on him. He seemed hesitant at first, but eventually agreed after some gentle encouragement. We walked in silence for a while, the only sounds coming from the crunch of gravel underfoot and the distant laughter of children playing. I kept glancing at him, noticing the lines of stress etched into his face and the lingering sadness in his eyes. He looked far older than his 25 years, and it broke my heart. "I don't know what to do with myself now," he said suddenly, pulling me from my thoughts. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I had my whole future planned out with her," he admitted, his voice raw. "And now, I feel lost. Like I don't even know who I am anymore without her." I stopped walking and turned to face him, placing a hand on his arm. "Jake, you're going to be okay," I said firmly. "You're still you, and maybe this is your chance to figure out who you are outside of a relationship. It's going to hurt for a while, but it won't hurt forever. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine for something. Reassurance, hope, or maybe just a sign that things would eventually get better. What if I never get over her? He asked, his voice trembling. You will, I replied, my own voice thick with emotion. And until that day comes, I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere. He pulled me into a hug, so tight it nearly stole my breath. I could feel his tears soaking into my shoulder as I wrapped my arms around him, holding him as if I could shield him from the pain, from the world itself. For a moment, we stood together, two people bound by shared sorrow and love, leaning on each other in a sea of emotions. As the weeks turned into months, the oppressive sadness in the house began to dissipate. Little by little, Jake started spending time with his friends again, his smile slowly returning. Still, he remained close to me, and our walks became a cherished routine. We talked about everything: his dreams, his fears, even the movies he loved as a kid. It felt as though I was rediscovering him, not as the little boy I had raised, but as the man he was growing into. Over time, I realized that this connection wasn't just helping him heal, it was healing me too. When my son Jack began to show his attentiveness, it didn't strike me as unusual at first. He had always been a thoughtful child, the type to bring me flowers from the garden or ask about my day as soon as he came home from school. But as he grew older, the way he expressed his care started to shift, becoming more focused and intense. After his father left, I had struggled to keep up with the house, the loneliness gnawing at me, leaving me feeling like my world had been fractured. Jack, sensing my distress, stepped in without hesitation. At 22, he was no longer the boy I remembered, but a young man, strong and self-assured, yet still carrying the same gentle nature that had always defined him. He began helping with everything, from fixing leaky faucets to preparing dinner when I was too tired. Having him around brought a sense of comfort, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone. One evening, we sat on the couch, the soft glow of the TV casting shadows across the room. We weren't paying much attention to the movie. Instead, we talked about his plans and aspirations for the future. Then, the conversation took an unexpected turn. You know, Mom, Jack began, his voice unusually tender. I feel like we understand each other better than anyone else. His words touched me and I smiled. We've always had a special bond, haven't we? His eyes lingered on mine, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a strange flutter in my chest, something I hadn't experienced in years. The feeling was brief, and I quickly dismissed it as nothing more than a mother's affection. But as the weeks passed, those moments began to happen more often. He started sitting closer to me, his hand finding mine during quiet moments and lingering there longer than necessary. One night after dinner, while I was washing the dishes, Jack came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. It seemed innocent enough, something he used to do when he was younger. But this time it felt different. His embrace was firmer, more deliberate, and I could feel his breath warm against the back of my neck. Jack, I said softly, trying to steady my voice. What are you doing? He didn't let go. Instead, he tightened his hold slightly, resting his chin on my shoulder. I'm just hugging you, Mom, he said, his voice tinged with vulnerability. Is that so wrong? There was something in his tone that made my heart ache, though not in the way it should have. Gently, I eased out of his embrace, turning to face him with a forced smile. Of course not, sweetheart, I said, ruffling his hair as I used to when he was little. But you're a grown man now. You don't need to cling to your mom like this. His smile faltered, replaced by a hint of sadness. Maybe I do, he whispered, his words barely audible before he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, confused and breathless. From that moment on, I began noticing everything. The way his gaze lingered on me just a bit too long. The way his hand would brush against mine whenever we crossed paths in the hallway. It was subtle but impossible to ignore. This wasn't just affection. There was something deeper, something I was too afraid to acknowledge. One rainy afternoon, I sat in the living room, staring out the window as raindrops slid down the glass. Jack walked in and sat beside me, so close that our legs were touching. For a while, he didn't speak. He just sat there, watching the rain with me. It's beautiful, isn't it? He said finally. Yes, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached for my hand, holding it gently. This time, I didn't pull away. I let him hold it, feeling the warmth of his skin against mine. It felt wrong, but at the same time, it was oddly comforting. Mom, he began, breaking the silence. I need to tell you something. I turned to look at him, my heart racing. His eyes held an intensity I couldn't name but knew all too well. I had seen that look before, just never directed at me. Jack, please, I whispered, my voice trembling. Don't. He tightened his grip on my hand. I can't help it, he said, his voice raw with emotion. I've tried, but I can't. The honesty in his words left me speechless. This was my son. The boy I had comforted through skinned knees and heartbreaks. But the man in front of me now was different. There was a yearning in his eyes that scared me. We can't do this, I said firmly, pulling my hand away despite the tears that welled in my eyes. This isn't right, Jack. He looked devastated, his expression that of a lost child. But you're everything to me, he said, his voice breaking. You're my soulmate. The word hit me like a blow to the chest. Soulmate. It wasn't a word a son used for his mother, yet there it was, lingering in the air between us like a forbidden promise. I stood up, instinctively trying to create some space between us. You don't mean that, I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. You're just confused. You've been looking after me for too long, and it's clouding your judgment. He shook his head, tears streaming down his cheeks. I know how I feel, and I think you do too, he said, his voice trembling. My breath caught, and for the briefest moment, I let myself feel it. The connection, the pull I had been denying for so long. But it was only a fleeting moment. I couldn't allow this. I couldn't let us cross a boundary that could never be uncrossed. I'm your mother, I whispered, my voice barely audible. And I love you, but not in that way. I can't. His eyes met mine, and the pain in his gaze cut deeper than any words ever could. I know, he said softly, but I don't think I can stop feeling this way. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the living room. Outside, the rain continued to fall, each drop echoing the silent tears I could no longer hold back. That night, the pale silver light of the moon streamed through the thin curtains of my bedroom, painting delicate patterns across the floor. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, unable to quiet the storm of thoughts swirling in my mind. Jack had grown distant lately. His usual playful demeanor had been replaced with a quiet sadness that clung to him like a heavy mist. Even without him saying a word, I could feel it, and it broke my heart knowing I was the cause. I turned onto my side, clutching my pillow tightly, trying to push away the ache in my chest. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards adjusting to the cool night air. I thought everyone was asleep, but I couldn't find peace. His words kept echoing in my head. You're my soulmate. I couldn't help but wonder how we had reached this point, how I had allowed things to escalate this far. My emotions were raw, tangled, and impossible to ignore. And then I heard it. A soft creak as the door opened. My body tensed, and I held my breath as the door slowly swung inward. Jack stepped into the room, his figure silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. His eyes shone in the darkness, filled with a sadness that made my heart ache. Jack, I whispered, my voice unsteady. What are you doing here? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he quietly closed the door behind him, as though afraid of disturbing the rest of the world. He hesitated, standing still for a moment, and I could see the turmoil etched across his face. It was the same conflicted look I had seen so often recently, filled with unspoken words and emotions he couldn't voice. I couldn't sleep. He finally said, his voice barely audible. I kept thinking about you. About us. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to tell him to go back to his room, to act as though this wasn't happening, but the words wouldn't come. I could only watch as he crossed the room, his footsteps soundless on the carpet. He stopped at the edge of the bed, looking down at me with an expression that was equal parts vulnerable and resolute. Jack, you shouldn't be here, I managed to say, though my voice lacked conviction. He shook his head, and before I could say more, he slipped into the bed beside me. The mattress shifted under his weight, and I felt the warmth of his body press against mine. It was a familiar comfort, but tonight it felt charged with something dangerous. Something we had both been struggling to suppress. Please, he whispered, his voice pleading. Just let me stay here for a little while. I don't want to be alone tonight. My heart ached painfully in my chest. I knew what this meant, knew how close we were to crossing an irreversible line. The tension in the room was palpable, thicker than it had ever been. Yet I couldn't bring myself to push him away. Instead, I turned to face him, our eyes meeting in the dim light. He reached out, his hand trembling as it cupped my cheek. His touch was tender, almost reverent, as though he feared I might vanish if he held on too tightly. Against my better judgment, I leaned into his touch, feeling the warmth of his palm against my skin. I closed my eyes, releasing a shaky breath. Mom, he whispered, his voice cracking. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending I don't love you like this. The weight of his words settled between us, heavy and unavoidable. I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze. The pain and longing there were unmistakable. I couldn't keep lying to him, or to myself. I know, I whispered, my voice trembling. I feel it too. But we can't, Jack. This isn't right. He moved closer, his forehead resting against mine, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. I could feel the restraint he was barely holding on to, the tension radiating from him. I've tried to stay away, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. I've tried to make these feelings disappear, but I can't. I love you. I need you. Not as my mother, but as something more. Tears filled my eyes, blurring my vision. I knew this was wrong. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to push him away, to end this before it went too far, but my body betrayed me. I leaned into him, craving the warmth and comfort I had been missing for so long. Jack, I breathed, my voice barely audible. If we do this, we can never go back. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine, filled with a mixture of fear and hope. I don't want to go back, he said firmly. I don't care about anything else. I just want you. Before I could respond, he closed the distance between us, his lips brushing against mine in the lightest of kisses. It was hesitant, as if offering me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I kissed him back, my hands tangling in his hair as I pulled him closer. The kiss deepened, growing desperate, years of unspoken emotions spilling out in that moment. His hands moved along my back, pulling me against him, and I could feel his heartbeat racing in time with mine. It was intense, consuming, and undeniably wrong. But it also felt natural, as if this was where we were meant to be all along. When we finally parted, both of us were breathing heavily, our foreheads pressed together as we tried to catch our breath. His eyes held a mix of fear and determination. We can't keep hiding this, he said quietly. We can't pretend it isn't real. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I nodded. I know, I whispered. But I'm scared, Jack. I don't know what this means or how we move forward. He brushed away my tears with his thumb, his touch impossibly tender. We'll figure it out, he promised. Together. In that moment, I believed him. Despite the guilt, despite the fear, I couldn't deny the truth anymore. I loved him too. More than I should. More than was right. But it was real. And it was ours. We lay there in the quiet, wrapped in each other's arms, the soft glow of the moonlight bathing us in its gentle light. The world outside faded away, leaving only us, tangled together in a love as beautiful as it was forbidden. We had crossed a line that could never be undone, but for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt at peace.